Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. My name is Mami Kataoka, Director of the Mori Museum in Tokyo. Having experienced the current pandemic with unveiled vulnerability of our human society, it is even more meaningful for museums and academic fields to stay connected, share knowledges with larger public. I would like to thank Soo-Kyun Lee, Senior Curator of International Art at the Hyundai Tate Research Center Transnational, with whom I initiated the discussion for this symposium a couple of years ago. And Devika Singh, Curator of International Art, and Emma, and all other staff at the Tate for the consistent commitment. And my acknowledgement also goes to two other conveners, Michio Hayashi, Professor at the Sophia University in Tokyo, and Christian Clavagana, Professor at the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna, for their generous support and advices during all these difficult times. And I'd like to also acknowledge Mori Art Museum Learning Team, particularly Sumika Takashima, Eise Shiraki, and Manabu Yahagi for their enthusiasm. On behalf of all these conveners and hosting members, I would like to welcome all the speakers and moderators who generously made their time available for 2 days and being very flexible throughout this changing situation. And I also welcome all the participants from around the world who have come together today online to exchange ideas and be a part of the discussion. Contemporary art community have been discussing colonialism and imperialism for some decades, and we have observed a number of important stories being discovered and debated through artist works and scholarly researches. In this symposium, we will be exploring the discussions and comparative analysis even further to see artistic practices and entangled history on non-European colonialism and the experience of domination through 4 sessions by 15 perspectives and case studies. There have been different histories of empires and colonial rules from North Africa to East Asia, followed by post-war independence, nation building and democratization, legacies of the Cold War, process of decolonization, and new nationalism and new colonialism. 4 sessions include panel 1, between nationalism and cosmopolitanism. Panel 2, the Cold War, liberation and modernism. And tomorrow in panel 3, multiplicity of the post-colonial, and panel 4, against the neo-colonial. We will learn diverse narratives, transnational artistic exchanges, and interdisciplinary networks over these regions in coming 2 days. I am very much hoping that this symposium will lead us to a better understanding of the challenges that we are collectively face today. Without further ado, I would like to hand over now to Devika Singh, the moderator for session 1. Please welcome Devika.
Thank you, Mami. Good morning. My name is Devika Singh. I'm a curator at Tate Modern and one of the conveners of the symposium. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the first panel of From Alexandria to Tokyo, Art, Colonialism, and Entangled Histories. As Mami mentioned, this symposium aims to decenter present-day debates on art and colonialism by focusing on non-European colonialism and experiences of domination that still remain relatively understudied, that is, in comparison to current debates on European colonialism and its legacies. At the same time, it is the impact that the experience of different forms of colonialism have had on the relational constitution of the modern world that will be interrogated, starting with our first panel. One of the questions that informs this panel is whether the formation of avant-garde artistic networks connected at an international level, can be separated from the hierarchical conditions under which connections were established, including those between Asian countries. This panel considers the relation between nationalism, conceived here in its emancipatory anti-colonial acceptation, and cosmopolitanism, conceived in the sense of Baba, Breckinridge, and Chakrabarty, and not necessarily as a form of Western domination, with case studies that focus on different inter-Asian experiences in the 1920s and 30s. While cosmopolitanism has rightly been associated with imperialism, which forced people into contact, these case studies also bring, as we'll see forward, the agency of specific artists, architects, dancers, and intellectuals. Our first speaker will be Fusako Inami, who is an assistant professor in Japanese and performance studies at the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at the University of Durham. Fusako, over to you.
Thank you, Devika, for the introduction. And I just thank you for being here. And I especially want to thank colleagues at Mori Art Museum and Tate for organizing this conference at such a difficult time for all of us. So this presentation is a part of larger project that I try to debate how encounters and spatial mobility in creative process contributes to desaturation, migration, and translation of embodied practices through artist networks. And this paper, I would like to talk a bit about Komaki Masahide, Japanese dancer Komaki Masahide, and Shanghai Balanus. And the bulk of archival research for this project remain to be undertaken due to COVID-19 and related travel restrictions. And so this paper would focus rather more on conceptual aspect of this project. So among various memoirs of self-reflection of Japanese dancer Komaki Masahide, the experience during his first week in Shanghai helped us to grasp the character of encounters on the street. In Petrushka's confession that he published in 1975, his account of Shanghai starts with the depiction of scenery that he saw in the flower garden, in which people are walking, chatting, and reading, smoking, or gathering together to have a rest. Stood still in front of the notice board, he reads, "No entrance for dogs," and "Yellow lace," written in both English and Chinese. And he saw only white people in the garden. And even given that this happened within the French concession, he cannot figure out how such a thing is possible and realizes that Shanghai is a complex cosmopolitan city. Intercosmopolitan and intimate hybrid performance styles attracted audiences from various backgrounds in places like Asakusa in Tokyo, Montmartre in Paris, Alexandria in Berlin, and West End in London. For example, Asakusa juxtaposes jazz and tango, opera, theatrical works, and comic songs with a sense of humor and at the time of rising militarism. In these productions, the body functions as a medium of expression in which embodied experience, here meaning incorporated bodily practice, functions as a means of transgressing cultural, class, and hierarchical boundaries. Komaki Masahide, who was both fascinated but also inspired by Asakusa dancing, headed for Paris to become a painter or a dancer. As a result of his unsuccessful trans-Siberian trip, he ended up receiving ballet training at Harbin Music Ballet School. And upon his graduation, he moved to Shanghai to dance for Shanghai Balanus. And subsequently, he contributed to ballet boom in post-war Japan. His journey throughout the 1930s and 40s, in particular, manifests the nexus of individual body, polity, and artist network. I argue that such a mapping of transnational mobility and network reconfigures the relationship between bodily practices and their relationship to topography. Komaki, who arrived in Harbin in 1933 and then Shanghai in 1940, often danced at the Leisham Theatre, which was originally opened by the British in 1867. With multiple times of building collapse, the current third building was opened in French concession in 1931. While the individual dancing bodies at the theater were inseparable from colonial sense of their respective nations, they also embodied the theatrical space through their collaborative artist networks in a way that transcended nation. Komaki's memoirs, which often contain some inconsistency, confusion, and forgetfulness, blur the boundary between the lived experience and its narrative. Such a layer of precarious states, including artist immigration status, question the extent to which national level territorial mapping joins with the terrain that individual steps on and occupy. So this paper explores how embodiment as a continuous practice may potentially rewrite existing topography. And the word topography here means human's relationship to the surface features of place or object. The relationship to place or object is unfixed, and this is the case especially for artists who lived at the time in Shanghai, often as exiles or immigrants from Europe, Russia, and inland Japan. And the way one occupies space is shaped through modal sensory experience, such as walking in a city, pausing to look at the things on the street, coming across people, and encountering unexpected events. Arthur Grayson, talking about Oxford Street in Ghana, argues that if there's any performative dimension to the street, it should not be mistaken as the performativity of occasional theatrical and political events. Rather, the character of walking on the street that has been, there's a delay on the screen. Rather, he says, the character of walking on a street that has been described exposes itself to the possibility of spontaneous events, that it themselves follow sets of performative scripts and reveal what we shall come to see as a certain important spatial logics. As Komaki wrote in his memoir, encounters with people encounters with people led him to unexpected stays or decisive career development. In this sense, the way one embodies space through sensory registers is a part of shaping topography as a way to rethink intricate terrain of human network and communication. Now moving to Shanghai Balanus itself. Shanghai Balanus was formed in 1934 by artists in exile from Russian Revolution and fleeing Nazi Germany and Nazi persecution, including former dancers from Diaghilev Balanus and Mariinsky Theatre. This professional ballet company was based at the Leisham Theatre in French Concession and financially supported by British, American, and French banks, with the salaries paid to the dancer in dollars. And its rehearsal floor was the same scale as the theater, so like they were able to use this the rehearsal stage as they perform in the theater. The work there was produced by experts in music, art, and dance. A feature of Diaghilev Balanus was the involvement of avant-garde artists, musicians, and practitioners in the production process. And this was also practiced by Shanghai Balanus, which was ingrained in Komaki's dance practices, as he collaborated with such figures as Fujita Tsuguharu, Koiso Ryohei, and Yoshihara Jiro in a post-war Japan. Although Komaki describes Shanghai Balanus as orthodox, modeled on Diaghilev's Balanus, how closely the nature of Shanghai Balanus reflected Diaghilev, as well as quality of Komaki's skill as ballet dancer, have been both questioned. On one hand, the Japanese newspaper in Shanghai at the time called him a top dancer, even when he was not named as principal dancer. On the other, later Japanese dancers and critics questioned the level of his training in ballet. At the same time, there are more recent research on Shanghai Municipal Orchestra and Shanghai Balanus to confirm the Shanghai Balanus focus on works based on Mikhail Forkin's original choreography for Diaghilev, along with similar costume and stage setting. Sorry, I guess, so this is Shanghai. This slides is a bit coming later on. So this is the journal that the journal, the Shanghai illuminated, reported the news when the Municipal Orchestra and Shanghai Balanus had Tchaikovsky week, when Komaki, in the year Komaki first played at Shanghai Balanus. And then also Iguchi Junko confirms that even like costume and stage setting, there were similarities between Diaghilev's Balanus and Shanghai Balanus. So this picture is coming from Komaki Masahide's book itself. Given his involvement with Japanese army and governmental figures and his later involvement, his role between the Japanese liquidation of the Balanus to the end of the World War, Komaki is one example of how individual body may function as a part of larger political and cultural propaganda while developing a career. Aside from the extent of Shanghai Balanus' authenticity and of Komaki's training in ballet, the shifting complexity of colonial mapping on which multicultural practitioners collaborated merit further attention. One's body as medium embodies experiences and operates even within a wider context of the body as polity, as mentioned. Nevertheless, I argue that it is not adequate to see individual body inherently restricted to its social boundary. The individual body is not only affected by the surrounding environment, but also continuously affected through individuals' action, movement, and mobility to reshape existing boundaries. One's understanding of space is shaped through individuals' perception and responses to surrounding realities. David Harvey places an importance on the individual's movement amid the complexities of social power, interaction, capital production, and consumption. He says, individual movement in space and time give meaning to the city's spaces and places. Every time I walk the city, I construct and reconstruct it for myself. While the individual body as political mediums function as a part of the polity, the individual body constantly deterritorializes the space it occupies. For the collectives of international artists in cosmopolitan Shanghai, especially, the sense of neighborhood with whom one shares one's confines was subject to constant remapping. Komaki reflects his interaction with Jewish pianist in exile, narrated as Professor Wolf, who contributed to Shanghai Balanus's performance of Petrushka. When he visited the Jewish area guided by this pianist, he felt unable to figure out where he was walking amidst the building clumped together like a maze. While walking and wandering around the metropolitan city offers a sense of one's location as related to map. Encounters and walking a company like this pianist around the city, metropolitan city, offers a sense of one. Encounters and arrival of walking accompanies, which Komaki experienced throughout his journey from Japan to have been from Shanghai to Japan, coalesce to make the unfamiliar to familiar, even when these individuals depart in a different path after all. As Komaki is guided by those he comes across on the way or whom he comes to know at the theater, strangers' neighborhood start to produce personal impression and potentially intimate memories. Through her palimpsest approach to the Shanghai home as cultural text, GD writes about how inhabitation produces space. Could you move on to the next slide, the final one? The home may begin as blueprints, but as architects and contractors leave and residents enter, homes turn into the theater for the lives of their inhabitants. Having collaborated with artists and dancers of various backgrounds through his work at the theater, Komaki experiences his inhabitational space differently from his first week of Shanghai. Such a change in appearance of the city suggests that individual movements and acts of inhabiting shape the meaning of the city space, while also suggesting that the movements through the network form a consciousness of the city, including chance encounters between people, which were decisive turning point in Komaki's career. The multisensory registers that one perceives on the street amid the interrelatedness of objects, people, and communities are a part of the process in which shifting topography emerges. Thank you.
Thank you very much for Sakura. We'll be taking questions at the end of our panel, but please do feel free to send these in using the YouTube comment bar as they arise, and we'll have the opportunity, as I mentioned, to address them at the end. Our next speaker is Elena Kapkova. Elena is a Tokyo and Kyoto-based curator and an art history professor at the Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto. Helena.
Thank you, Devika. Thank you for your kind introduction. Thank you, Mori. Thank you, Tate, for having me. We have very short time from presentation, so let me jump right in. And we'll move the slide. Craft is political, or so have argued many scholars in the recent years, writing publications such as the forthcoming D. Wood's edited volume of the exact title, Craft is Political. The exploration of Japanese craft and its political context will be at the core of this paper. We will explore an unexpectedly diverse group of people who all found themselves in Japan in the early 1920s. The diversity of the group was not only represented by the members' different national background, but also by different motivations for the study of the Japanese craft. Some recognize it as a superior art form. Some, on the other hand, approach it as an opportunity to express political agendas. This study and collective exploration happened within networks that had already loose or strong political agendas, including a group of Japanese nationalists or Indian anti-colonial revolutionaries. It was under the scaffolding of Japan's own ambitious colonial construction that we found energetic operation of transnational networking among anti-colonial activists who sought refuge within Japanese territory. Among them were artists whose encounter in Japan led to some extraordinary collaborative projects, such as the Gokonte dormitory in Pondicherry, the first so-called first modernist building in India. The focus here will be given to two interconnected networks that were established in Japan but developed transnationally, and thus link the two colonial narratives that are seldomly associated with one another: Japanese imperialistic nationalism and its pan-Asianist activities, and the struggle for Indian independence. The starting point of our story will be the Japanese stay of French painter and occultist Mira Richard, later the mother of Pondicherry, and her husband, Paul, under the auspices of the ultra-nationalist group, the Black Dragon Society, Koku Ryukai. The network around the couple kept meeting at the following two social planes: Theosophical Society, established in Tokyo by Irish poet, revolutionary and theosophist James Cousins in 1920, and the Network for Modern Japanese Craft and Design, Garakuta Shu, active until 1940. This network of collectors practicing traditional Japanese arts and crafts was unusually open to foreign members, and as such became a hub for fostering transnational encounter in arts, political debate, and perhaps intelligence exchange. The members included Czech-American designers Antonín and Noemi Raymond and Keshoram Sabharwal, a journalist associated with Indian revolutionary Raj Behari Bose. The extensive and transnational research has developed out of my pondering of a footnote in the autobiography of Antonín Raymond, where he mentioned, I will quote, "Gurcharan Singh was a young Indian student who had come to Japan to study pottery. It was through him that we were introduced to this art in which the Japanese are supreme. It was him who introduced us to Heibonji. Heibonji, totally deaf and dumb, accepted my wife as a pupil. She went regularly to his little house, sat on tatami, and was taught painting and Japanese writing. Heibonji was the organizer and the principal figure of the Garakuta Shu, a society of 33 members of all classes of society, artisans, artists, connoisseurs of human activities on all forms," end quote. I became fascinated and used transnational approach on the selected examples of his and his wife's work, researched the archive, and reconstructed an untangled narrative that only fragmentarily I will present today. Some parts of it, such as the history of Garakuta Shu, were entirely marginalized, and I'm happy to tell you that we are preparing an exhibition on Garakuta Shu, which will open at the end of February next year. On the contrary, a Mingei movement that is related to our networks here through some members was widely researched and thus is well known. The group of elite artists and intellectuals was active in the interwar period in Japan and beyond. It was led by Yanagi Soetsu, who codified a precise vision for craft in modern Japan. Kikuchi Yuko defines it as cultural nationalism, or a contribution to the creation of a modern national style. Yanagi was an Anglophile, friend of Bernard Leach, and he rooted his concept of Mingei in the ideals promoted by the arts and crafts movement and William Morris. Craft was, no doubt, political for Yanagi. Gurcharan Singh became tightly associated with the group and thus was the connecting link with the Theosophical Society he was also a member of at the time and the Garakuta Shu network. Thank you. Singh is regarded as the father of studio pottery in India. His family sent him to Japan to learn about commercial ceramics. He set off in 1919, took a course in the Tokyo Institute of Technology, as is now known. He learned Japanese, so he was able to communicate. During his first year, he met Yanagi by chance and received the invitation to his home. He met Leach, Tomimoto Kenkichi, and other very famous potters. On Yanagi's advice, he visited Korea, and he also traveled to China. In addition to his schooling, he trained in local potteries in Tokyo, in Nagoya, famous Seto kilns. And it was from Seto he wrote to Noemi Raymond about his motivation to join Heibonji Society. He stated he joined because he, I will quote, wanted to learn something about Japanese life and Japanese crafts. Abigail McGowan, in her book Crafting the Nation in Colonial India, stated that crafts became a battleground for colonial politics and economics, and asked a question Did nationalists suggest new ways of reinvigorating crafts or adopt colonial views of native craftsmen needing an educated elite to direct them? Singh represented the former. He searched for the new ways for craft and sought education abroad in Japan. He socialized not only with fellow artists, but also with several fellow countrymen, revolutionaries such as Sabharwal. Sabharwal was a journalist and correspondent of the Bombay Chronicle and the Japan Times. In a confidential memorandum from 1919, he was presented as a complicit in an Indo-German conspiracy. Sabharwal had worked as a secretary of Indian freedom fighter Lala Lajpat Rai and escaped to Japan to live and work with another significant revolutionary, Raj Behari Bose. Bose settled in Japan in 1915 and found support among Japanese Pan-Asianist nationalists, the same network familiar to James Cousins that we mentioned, and also that supported the Richards during their stay in Japan from 1916 to 1920. You can see Tagore in the picture. The encounters with Tagore happened. I will just document, hopefully quickly. This is a famous encounter in Japan, Richards and Tagore. And one more slide. Yes, this is a group photo where we found Sabharwal, the Raymonds, and others I will mention just now. The Richards and the ideas of Sri Aurobindo were very influential in spiritual nationalist circles in Japan, and through Sabharwal they reached also the TS circle, including the Raymonds, Singh, and Philippe Barbier-Saint-Hilaire, who upon leaving Japan devoted most of his life to Sri Aurobindo and his ashram. The Richards' 4 years exile in Japan was filled with activities that fueled Asian and Japanese radical nationalism. Moreover, it was crucial for Mira Richard, later the mother, who as a trained artist was acutely aware of Japanese artistic sensibility, and the study of Japanese arts determined her long-term aesthetic preference. A vast collection of Japanese objects ranging from artworks to ordinary objects surrounded Mira in her Pondicherry living quarters throughout her long and productive life, and reminded her of the refinement and superior aesthetic experience that she found in Japan. There are many quotes we have by her about this. I will say just a few. 4 years from an artistic point of view, I lived from wonder to wonder. Beauty rules over Japan as an incontestable master. And lastly, Japanese art teaches the unity of art with life. As the ashram community was growing around Sri Aurobindo and the mother, she decided to build a new building nearby in Pondicherry near the headquarters that would serve as a dormitory and a place of contemplation. She named it the Golconda. The beginning of this project can be found in the extensive correspondence. Can we move the slide, please? The extensive correspondence between Philippe Saint-Hilaire, who is known as Pavitra, and Noemi Raymond. They wrote to each other for a very long time, many years between 1927 to 1966. Architecture is mentioned rarely, but in the letter from 1933, Noemi shares with Pavitra the principles of the atelier of the Raymond, and she says that it is simplicity, it is a return to simplicity and the innovative usage of traditional Japanese building principles that were the key to their work. For them, the traditional building craft was an encapsulation of ideas and mechanisms of Japanese culture. A year later, in September 1934, Pavitra asked for more information. Noemi sends him more examples, and based on that, the Raymonds received the commission of the Golconda, and in 1938 they visit India to supervise the construction process. They were seeking the best solutions for the hot and humid climate and oriented the building to face the sea breeze that permeates the dormitory and cools the interior, which is quite essential in the southern India, as many of you I'm sure know. The north and south facade are constructed from movable louvers that let the cool in and provide pleasant shade. The sliding doors were executed in the Japanese Yamato-based style from horizontally staggered boards. The gaps in the pattern allow for the circulation of air and provide privacy required for solitary yoga practice. Like the building, the garden also is a hybrid of modernist of the characteristic stone lanterns I will show you at the very end. Raymond called the young architects to help him on site, George Nakashima, later Sundarananda, and František Sammer. Can I move this slide, please? These two architects came to him, František Sammer came to Raymond upon completing internship and assistantship with Le Corbusier in Paris and in the Soviet as well. Golconda and the experience of the ashram had a formative effect on Nakashima, who became a lifetime member of the community. Although he often returned to India, his life was to be primarily spent in the United States, and he became very well-known furniture designer. So I will conclude. Thank you. To conclude, it is clearly no coincidence that we can find Japanese craft and somewhat Japanese sensibility lingering in the South Indian Pondicherry. The mother was a genuine admirer of Japan, and as an artist, she appreciated the refined qualities of Japanese art that she studied there. However, her choice of introducing Japanese craft into the ashram space may be not only aesthetic, but also strategic, maybe even political. The serene transnational beauty promoted by the ashram, not only in the design of the new building, Golconda, but also in the daily conduct, lifestyle, and fashion, set the community visually apart from the general Indian public that surrounded it. The image of the ashram has been a composite of many different elements, a manifestation of diversity of the community itself, but the Japanese beauty and crafts enjoy a special place within it. The headquarters is filled with Japanese craft objects such as screens, textiles, and furniture. The garden of the Golconda is furnished with the stone lanterns. The Japanese craft became the connecting link of entangled colonial struggles and remains as their gentle witness to this day. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for all the archives that I could study and use the material today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elena, for presenting new perspectives on the Golconda Ashram. Our last speaker in this panel is Sanatanand Tamotarampillai. Sanatanan is an artist and a senior lecturer in the Art History Department at the University of Jaffna in Sri Lanka. Sanatanan, over to you.
Thank you, Devika. Thank you, organizers, for inviting me for this conference. Indian Nationalism and the Making of the Modern in Sri Lankan Art. Donald Petriozzi argues that modernity is thus the paradoxical status quo of nationalism, existing as a virtual site constituting the edge between the material residues and the relics of the past, an adjacent empty space that feature is imagined to be and demanding to be filled. Partha Mitter observed in the Indian context that cultural nationalism was cultural nationalism was a response of traditional societies to the challenges of modernism, as well as the resistance of European colonial empire. The Indian nationalist movement came into fruition with Mahatma Gandhi's Swadeshi self-rule movement, launched to gain independence from British rule in 1920s. This self-rule movement fueled multiple revivalist movements in the field of art, such as Bengal School of Rabindranath Tagore and Shantiniketan Forest University, founded by the poet Rabindranath Tagore. Unlike in India, the Sri Lankan elite attempt to gain power through collaborating with the colonial administration. Therefore, there was no significant freedom struggle as such in Sri Lanka. As Michael Roberts correctly identified, nationalism in Sri Lanka was also inspired and prompted by the nationalist movement within the neighboring subcontinent. cultural heredity and racial continuity was strategically employed by the local elites to accommodate certain selective ideas from India. The identification or differentiation with or from India, on the other hand, provide a new bargaining position to local elites with colonial power. This uh, realignment also strengthened the emergence of social network among the cultural elites of the region. In 1903, the Ceylon National Review, edited by Ananda Kumar Swami, emphasized the mental and spiritual kingship existing between India and Sri Lanka. India represents the motherland, but as Nira Vikramasinghe traces in the following decades, the fewer references were made to India as mother culture. Vikramasinghe further states that it was no longer India, but a specific geographical portion of India, the land of Aryas, identified as province of Bengal, which was looked upon as the motherland of the Arya Sinhalese. A Ceylon Daily News editorial registered this transformation by quoting C.R. Das on nationalism. I'm quoting, a process through which a nation expresses itself and finds itself not in the isolation from other nations. Hence, Indian intellectualism had an impact on the westernization process and the mechanics of churning out a new art from colonial culture of Ceylon. In this context, Sri Lanka became another site for dialogue between Western and the Eastern cultures. Visits by the National Congress leaders, Indian art critics, and exposure to Swadeshi art of India by means of visiting exhibition performances were the major circuits through which Indian nationalist thought and its artistic manifestation entered Sri Lanka. Tagore's visit in 1922 and 1934 were crucial in the production of new Sri Lankan art. In his first visit, Tagore aspired to galvanize the island community towards the larger imagined Indian nation. Since the island had been under the 400 years of European colonial rule, it could only be accommodated in the larger India, into larger India through the decolonization, de-westernization process. Even though in Tagore's second visit, the poet expressed similar sentiments, his second mission was more progressively artistic and cultural than his first one. Tagore's mission included an arts and craft exhibition by Shantiniketan community. During this visit, he laid foundation stone for a new institution in Sri Lanka called Sri Pali, founded on the ideals of Shantiniketan. He traveled around the island with his cultural troupe for nearly 1 month. Tagore addresses were accompanied by classical and modern Indian dances, whereas theatre performances and recitals of his poems in Bengali and English. He said, we are now separated by circumstances. Original art and culture suffered as a result of this disassociation, as a plant suffered when it's transferred to a pot uprooted from the soil. With politics, I am not concerned. My mission is of spiritual delight of art and beauty, far and wide. On his second visit, Tagore acknowledged the political differences between colonial India and colonial Ceylon and presented the idea of an identity based on the shared culture. Interestingly, Tagore, in his civilizational mission to the island, used the Aryan theory to prove hereditary link with Sinhalese, based on the Vijaya myth. The poet says, Sinhala was once colonized geographically by Bengalis. Let's colonize again spiritually. Let the vital and the organic connection between Sinhalese and the Vanga be re-established through the cultivation of mother tongue. Let the Sinhalese realize the utter futility of pursuing the path of imitation. Let them not barter their souls in exchange for the costly clothes of the European materialism. Let the dead weight of convention be displaced by the eternal potency of life. Interestingly, Tagore interpreted the nationalist binary of Western materialism and Eastern spiritualism by making Bengal the seat of the Aryas, according to Sri Lankan chronicles, become the seat of the eternal potency of life. Similarly, when he addressed the Tamil Hindu audience in Jaffna, he metaphorically referred the mythical bridge that Rama built between India and Sri Lanka, mentioned in the Indian great epic Ramayana, in order to link it to his own political and cultural mission. His message became more explicit with a cultural truth that brought along with him. Nandalal Bose, one of the teacher at Shantiniketan and key figure in India's movement for national art, visited the island with him. Bose symbolically exhibited his large drawing of Sangamita bringing the sacred boat tree to Sri Lanka from India, along with the nearly 150 other works, out of which 56 were Tagore's. Intention behind the exhibition was to highlight what these drawings were highlight the similarities between the cultural and spiritual mission of Tagore and the Sangamita, the daughter of Emperor Asoka and the sister of Mihundutera, who introduced Buddhism to Sri Lanka. Tagore was to represent a 20th century ambassador of culture, a kind of Asoka's ambassador of 200 years ago. Tagore's second visit created a wave of change in the cultural sphere, which encouraged mushrooming of cultural societies, groups, and attracted many peoples toward Shantiniketan for inspiration. In the following years, the Sinhalese artist pair underwent a paradigm shift with innovation in the field of literature, performing arts, and visual arts. The Ceylon Art Club was established in 1922 and was active till 1932 under the leadership of C.A. Windsor, who was a painter and a colonial inspector of art in the schools. Although Windsor admired E.P. Havel's intervention in art education in Bengal and the Bengal school attempts to reinvent tradition, he was also inspired by the Shantiniketan model based on the eclectic union of local and the global. In this context, the CAC openly opposed the values of the Ceylon Society of Art that was established with the support of the British establishment to propagate Victorian and Edwardian art traditions. Rabindranath Tagore was an honorary life member of Ceylon Art Club and member of the group met Tagore in Colombo in 1934. The CAC focused on New Eastern art through its exhibition and talk series. It organized an exhibition of Sunya Nidharmi's painting in 1923 and display works of contemporary Indian artists in 1930. These Indian art exhibitions not only propose a first alternative to the prevailing pseudo-academism in the artistic sphere, but also reshape the mission of the colonial art institutions like Ceylon Society of Art. The Ceylon Society of Art organized 3 contemporary Indian art exhibitions around the same time. The third Indian art exhibition was made possible by visit of the Mukul De, a student of Shantiniketan and formerly the principal of Government College of Art, Calcutta. Apart from the exhibition, Windsor organized lecture by prominent Indian art historian Stella Cambridge, who lectured on the significance of Indian art. The Ceylon Society of Art organized a lecture series entitled Ancient to Modern Indian Art by an art critic, Venkatachalam, during the period. The topic of national art was openly debated in the English dailies in Ceylon during this time. The period between 1930 and 1940 marked the close affiliation between Shantiniketan and Sri Lanka. In 1930, Solius Mentis, who was assigned to paint murals at Kelaniya Vihara, was sent to Ajanta, Ellora, and Bark caves for inspiration by his patron. During this visit, he also visited Shantiniketan and met Nandalal Bose. Interestingly, during this time, mural painting was at its peak as the national allegory in Shantiniketan. Considering the political historical movement in the race of the nation, a national nation state of Sri Lanka, the selection of ancient Buddhist sites in India was inspired by the nationalist and Orientalist notions of identity, authenticity, and art, and the Sinhalese imagination of Aryan legacy. Thus, the nationalist and Orientalist discourse of revivalism would now also be reflected in the artistic formulation of this project. The presence of the new traditionalism of Bengal school, particularly particularly the art of Rabindranath Tagore, Nandalal Bose, and Sharda Okil is evident in Mendes' murals in Colonium. Both Bose and Mendes drew and painted the image of Sanghamitta, bringing the Bodhi tree to Sri Lanka in a similar elongated linear style around the same time. Harry Pearis was trained in Slade School of Art, London, and was strongly inclined towards the academic painting tradition. However, his years in Shantiniketan as a teacher between 1934 and 37, and his interaction with Tagore for fashion in a manner of speaking, his sensitivity to his own cultural moment. LTP Manjushri, a Buddhist monk, went to Shantiniketan in 1932 to learn Chinese, and then became a painter through the inspiration of Nandalal Bose. Manjushri copied many of the ancient Sri Lankan Buddhist murals as a way to documenting the local artistic heritage. Similarly, Harry Peary's concern with the preservation of old murals were highlighted in his writing. Later in 1943, when the country's first group of modernist artists were formed, Harry Pearis became the secretary and the Manjushri was one of the founder members. Many of the members of the group were from the Windsor's Ceylon Art Club. Similarly, Ananda Samarakon, who composed the Sri Lankan national anthem, was a student of Shantiniketan in 1930s. He followed this visual idiom of Bengal school and valorized the Buddhist past and the country past of the country and Sinhalese rural life in his paintings. His influence led to the ultra-nationalism turn in the visual art in 1950s, which ran parallel to 43 groups' cosmopolitanism. Somabandhu Vidyapati, a well-known Buddhist temple muralist and a theatre set designer, was also a student of Shantiniketan between 1945 and 1947. Documented Sri Lankan art history has portrayed the modernist art practices as outcome of westernization and resistance to British colonialism. However, selection of examples mentioned above reveal how some of the protagonists is active in the project of making the new art, both in elite and popular art world in Sri Lanka, were explicitly and implicitly connected to the Indian revivalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanantanan. As we gather questions through the YouTube chat bar, I will begin by asking you a question directed to all three of you on the persistent use of Western channels of communication. All your papers, of course, shift the emphasis away from the West/Asia relations, yet it could be argued that Western channels of communications have only the assumed use of English as a connecting language in South Asia, of course, but also I noticed how Fusako, the Komaki had to resort to Russian, if I'm not mistaken, to be introduced to the Shanghai Balanus. So how did these Western channels of communications, how were they still used by Asian interlocutors in their contact with each other?
Yes, I think for the topic I'm working on, maybe there are two levels to this. One would be the language, and certainly the foreigners who were capable of speaking Japanese, their experiences of that, of this, let's say, early 1920s Japanese environment are rather different to those who were not able to communicate it in Japanese. And I'm always very interested to see that difference and to find artists, in my case, or architects, designers who actually could communicate in Japanese at the time. And I mentioned a few today. The counterparts, the Japanese at the time, would have quite a good, and again, we are talking about quite a limited percentage again of the population, of course, but in that the foreign languages were taught in Japan, especially German. So again, that would be an option. But the other side of the story is that 1920s Japan was already very well modernized in the sense that you would have, for example, at least partially written English press. It's a very interesting medium called Asahi Graph that it was richly illustrated and included Japanese text as well as summary in English, and so on. So infrastructures were in operation. So yeah, maybe I can stop here and hand over to Fusako what she has to say.
Yeah, so like as I couldn't speak that part today, but yeah, Komaki spoke Russian because he lived there before moving to Shanghai. So I guess like the communication method for him was like speaking Russian, and sometimes like he was given some sort of tension, like political tension in Shanghai. He was sometimes like encouraged to speak Russian instead of like English or Japanese. But at the same time, the dancers that he engaged with at the Shanghai Balanus were coming from Russia or Germany or England and different parts of the world. So like English would be one of the main communication methods, but at the same time, it seems that there are different range of languages, even if it's like Western language. It seems that it was very much complicated in terms of like what language might be used in what occasions because of the political tension and also like international settlements. And so it seems that it was rather a sensitive issue in which language they communicate. And also in terms of Shanghai Balanus, existing research on Shanghai Balanus tend to focus on newspapers, reviews and news that in different languages, so French journals and Japanese and Russian journals, and that sort of like journals tend to be the main sources to know Shanghai Balanus, given that they don't have recorded, for example, like existing video for us to know actual performance, like actual sort of like moving event. We don't have like that sort of like resources, so that written languages, both spoken but also like written language such as like newspaper tend to be sources for us to know. But of course newspaper written in different languages might communicate message in a different way with the political tension. So I guess like both, yeah, it seems that not only the language itself, but also like the both spoken and written, that sort of like two dimensions in terms of like what kind of like communication might have been used that time.
Thank you. Sanatanan, do you have something to add to this?
Yeah, thank you for that interesting question. First of all, like the interaction between India and Sri Lanka is not a new thing, or it's not a colonial thing. It's also happening in the pre-colonial era. But this after in 1920s and 30s interaction is slightly different from the earlier one because of it's also shaped by the colonial culture or nationalism, or particularly Buddhist singular Buddhist nationalism. So in the mediators, which I talk about, like C.F. Windsor is a colonial art educator, and he actually came and brought the Indian influences into Sri Lanka. And also when I mentioned about Harry Peatis, who also inspired by the Tagore's teaching, also like directed by his teacher at Slade to go and join Tagore in his project. So it's also like kind of these projects also mediated by some of the Westerners. So that's number one. Second thing is also like in terms of language issue, like in 30s and it was kind of English as a kind of prime language for political exchanges and social exchanges, and in the whole construction of modern in Sri Lanka is partly a kind of an elite activity. So in that case, in 1956, Sri Lanka went into the kind of a Sinhala only act, which made Sinhala as official language in Sri Lanka, which led to the separatist move in Tamil and development of Tamil nationalism and against the Sinhala nationalism and the civil war and all kinds of things. So it's a kind of, that area is very specific, that's very important to see how this whole colonial category of the nation or the Sri Lanka as a kind of a nation, as a continuity of the kind of a colonial nation existed till that 1956. So I think so there is a kind of a lot of relevances and to think about this kind of how Western and the English shape the whole art production.
Thank you. We have several questions that have come in, but before I move to these, I wanted to ask all three of you about your response, as to what your response is to what is sometimes called now so-called mobility bias in transnational art history and in world history, and the rootedness, or at least the reinvention of locality of many nationalist narratives. And to this, of course, we can also connect the apparent paradox of transnational networks informing actually territorialized ideas of nationalism. And this may be particularly relevant for the interwar period and the levels of transnational exchanges that we've mapped in your three papers. Who would like to go ahead? Helena.
Thank you for the question. Yes, so the idea of Japan as a closed insular nation is very much a part of this sort of nationalist, even more extreme movement that is happening in the years of modern Japanese history, and precisely uses or taking advantage of the fact that it is more complicated to move from Japan, but it of course was done, and in the modern era people used the railway, the Trans-Siberian way, and so on. So it was obviously a strategical narrative that still is sometimes used today, which I found quite puzzling, because we know, on the other hand, that lots of interesting encounters visual culture precisely because Japan was connected to the continent and other areas through maritime networks and so on. So yes, this kind of Japanese isolation or insular situation is very much a part of this. And then we have this kind of small percentage, it's very interesting, group of transnational travelers who I talked about. I would like to mention here this very special position of the Garakutashu group that deserves some attention, I think, because they do, on one hand, promote this kind of nostalgic traditional view of Japan as a kind of quite a special old, rather maybe even isolated culture. On the other hand side, they are very interested in what's going on abroad, and they are open, and they really accepted even foreigners and women as members, which is extremely unusual for the time and for this kind of artistic clubs that, again, are still today, some of them very much male and very much invitation only. You can't get to this club normally. So yes, I would probably end it here.
Thank you. Sanatana?
Yeah, no, I just want to add something and also when I was reading this Tagore's visit and the way then the Sri Lankan art developed after 1956, I found that Tagore's internationalism and humanism is not received well in Sri Lanka. It's also based on the whole, and it's his argument of culture, spirituality, classicism, and all these things are invested in a kind of a very nationalist project in Sri Lanka. So that was a kind of an irony in the whole discussion. So, and I think it's part of this whole part of the problem is also like, it's also a kind of very elite modernist movement, or the politics is a very elite movement, elite politics. So in that case, this whole sort of a going against the international current and investing some of these ideas into a kind of nationalist project is a kind of a part. It's one of the characteristics of this part of the world. And also, like naturally it's an island, and it's also connected to the trade routes and other kinds of colonial routes, and then this nationalism is actually working against it. So it may be an interesting thing to look at. Yeah. So just to add how Tagore was received, and through that example itself, that we can understand this problem.
Kusako, thank you. Would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I guess like the mapping, like territorial issue was constantly changing at the time. So even within the this artist network, or like, you know, the collective, the situation changed from say 1934 to the end of the World War, and from the beginning, more sort of British dancers were leading the group. Whereas at the end, toward the end of the Second World War, Komaki Masahide took in charge of the group in a way, because of this certain nationals were sent to camp, or kind of like requisition. So it's the territorial mapping was constantly changing, and so it was. But at the same time, everyone was moving to the Shanghai, like either exile or immigrant. So nothing was very stabilized, and this territorial mapping confines and who occupies what was in a constant change. And it seems that they, for example, like Japanese dancers who were, or artists and intellectuals who were involved in the Shanghai art scene, sometimes couldn't speak their experience after they went back to Japan for some time because of this political issue. So yeah, mobility as well as territorial mapping and also like political tension was quite heightened at the time, it seems.
Thank you. So I'll read out one of the first questions, or perhaps questions/comments that we received. One pertains to the influence and the traction of Japanese aesthetics. I'm reading out here. What theories do we have as to why the Japanese aesthetic was and continues to be admired by so many other cultures? It seems to have a somewhat universal appeal. Now, of course, Komaki was Japanese himself, so I assume this is more a question for Sanatanand and Elena. Do you have, in short, something to say to this? I don't know if there are any theories that help us understand this attraction.
Yeah, well, if I may start on this, I mean, we are very much indebted here to the whole book of Japonism. I mean, the Japonism really put the seed into the minds and creative minds of many artists, as we know, in Europe and the States and all over, and really created this image of Japan as the ultimate place of for arts. And it was not only writing, and Ernest Fenollosa was also very important here. So we have many books ranging from fiction to essays. And one more, I mentioned theosophy in my paper, and the whole kind of new spirituality, occult movement of the late 19th century and beyond also promoted this image of the East, and Japan was part of that. That is where the ultimate things in terms of spirituality and arts lie. So this was also a great motivation and had a huge impact.
A question that has come in from Hamad Nasser, which I'll read out. Can the speakers reflect on the role of printed matter, in particular illustrated publications and photo books, where the role of language is not as important in circulating competing visual worlds? Fusako and Sanantanand, you both drew on printed publications.
Yes, I also, just to add to your earlier question, saying that this Okakura's involvement in this Pan-Asianism and his association with Bengal school is also very important in this South Asian region in terms of Japan's contribution. And in terms of Sri Lanka, there is also a link in terms of Buddhism. So it's also Buddhism as a kind of a larger cosmopolitan or a cosmopolitan world, and how that is connected to the kind of a imagination of a kind of a pre-colonial society is also very important. And Japan's aesthetics become part of that whole imagination. Like in terms of the second question, I think, yeah, that's a wonderful question, because what I found from my research is like this whole the realism, how the realism entered into the kind of Sri Lankan mural painting is partly through this kind of illustration, both from the Europe and India. And also in terms of some South India, some of the like woodcut prints actually entered the Tamil regions in Sri Lanka, in which they transfer those woodcuts into a kind of a larger murals. So so without language, actually these images, actually the printed material actually traveled. And later on, these woodcut prints were transferred into a kind of Raja Ravi Verma print, holograph prints and things like that. So then it started influencing the popular visual culture in the region. So yeah, so print culture, and also with theater, actually. Theater and the print played a major role in shaping the visual culture in this region.
Thank you. Fusako, what about the illustrated dimension of printed matter in your case? How much may that have influenced dance practices, the influence of the Shanghai Balanus?
So given that there's no recorded resources, the print newspaper and photos that are the sources that we know, and sometimes like even in the press they would use the photography of the production, and I guess that's the only way we can know about the theater. Like theatrical production, but at the same time, so I guess like the print culture has a lot of influence in terms of how we know about the thing, like how we know about the Balanus, Shanghai Balanus. But at the same time, how things might be used, how things might be illuminated, might be depending on who uses that images in how. So like different media, different newspapers might use the resources in different way given that political tension at the time. So I guess knowing through print culture with explanation, like a verbal explanation, it's kind of like difficult to know how much we could know through those resources if we can rely on those print culture, newspaper, that sort of, I mean, even like print culture as.
Yes, and of course also it's very different to draw on visual sources for performance than for murals, as Sanantanand showed us. But you rightly highlight, of course, how we as researchers heavily rely on these visual sources that are very precious to us. Another question from our co-convener Michio Hayashi. Some concepts brought up in Inami-san's presentation, such as chance encounter, object, people, theater, interrelationship, seem to resonate with surrealist ideas. Would you elaborate on the question?
I mean, it's interesting how, for example, like surrealist artists in, for example, European context, worked in a theatrical culture, such as, like, for example, Dali worked on ballet production. And I mean, I haven't thought about chance encounter itself in this context with surrealist idea, but I guess it's more sort of like, if we talk about unconscious encounter with ideas, or like even like Dada sort of like reassociation and idea generation, there would be connection between those, and also like, given how theatrical culture at the time were created. But it made me think, I mean, I couldn't talk about that, but there were some interrelatedness between authors who were involved in new sensationist school, like something called Shinkankakuha in Japanese. And those authors were heavily involved in, for example, like or Dadaism, and they used, for example, Fourier association as a way to create novel or like lighting. And then Komaki Masahide was related to those authors, especially in the post-war time. He worked with, for example, like Kawata Yasunari. So I guess there are relations between those. But chance encounter itself, I was more thinking of chance encounters on street, and I didn't particularly make connection in terms of historical sense, chance encounters in relation to surrealism or like Dadaism at the time. So it might be interesting for you to think about. Thank you so much.
Thank you. A question from Ming Tianpo. You each set the articulation of nationalism in a transnational context. What does cosmopolitanism mean in each of these contexts? And how does it nuance our understanding of this concept? So that is the concept of cosmopolitanism. Elena, would you like to begin?
All right, thank you, Ming, for the tricky question at the end. So I think for me, transnational approach is about figuring out the national specificities in visual production. So what constitutes modern Japanese expression, etc. And then analyzing works such as Golconda that doesn't fit that idea of certain national specific approach or expression. So for that, I see transnational networking, transnational activity, and then production useful. Now, with the cosmopolitanism, I think these things overlap, but for the cosmopolitan movement or exchange, I don't see that need for national expression. Yeah, I see it more as a articulating certain cosmopolitan international exchange. So yes, some of the meetings that I talked about could be approached through that theory and lens, but because I am more interested, for example, in analyzing creations such as Golconda, transnational approach is much more productive one for me, I think.
Thank you. Sanatana and Fusako, would you like to answer this question too?
Yeah, I think in the Sri Lankan context, and the material I brought into the discussion today is actually based on that observation. What I can see is that cosmopolitanism in this context is a kind of a way of approach or a kind of attitude which actually we see that as that 43 group which I mentioned, that artist group is having a kind of they're very eclectic. They draw in material from like French art schools and academism and Indian nationalism or Indian Sudeshi art and everything. And then they found their own expression in that. So they were not, and also in their 10th exhibition, I think in their in the 10th exhibition catalog, they also mentioned that the real problem, which that their 10th exhibition happened in 1955, just before the Sinhala Only Act, and in which they mentioned that the real danger or real demon which we face is the nationalism and national art as a category. So I think they were, if you compare to the other movements in that particular era, I think they were more cosmopolitan in this in their approach. So I find in this context, I think cosmopolitanism is a kind of as a kind of approach and a kind of attitude.
Thank you. Prosecco?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. It's interesting to think about like both like cosmopolitanism on one hand and transnationalism on the other hand, especially in the interwar context at this point, at this time, because for example, like Komaki Masahiro was exposed to aspects of cosmopolitanism in Asakusa culture in Tokyo, like dance reviews and theater culture. On the other hand, what is interesting, for example, like the case of Shanghai Balanus is that people itself migrated, not only like practices migrated to different countries, but the idea of that Balanus itself is displaced from Russia, France to Shanghai with the people migration, like people's migration. So in that case, not only just cosmopolitan, but this displaced practices and people's culture, and how that migration, like added migration, created different culture from original context, but then that led to further, for example, like post-war ballet boom is coming. I mean, one root is coming from Shanghai Balanus. So that sort of like trans culture, or like the practices that migrated from country to country, not just happened within the certain context, like for example Shanghai or like Asakusa, or that sort of like city, but how that practices migrated is quite fascinating to talk, to think about, especially around this Shanghai Balanus, and in particular, like in this time frame.
Thank you. Following from this, I actually wanted to ask you myself about the place of so-called artistic retreats, or quote unquote provincial cities for cultural exchanges and national or nationalist revivalism. We tend, of course, to emphasize the role of metropolitan centers as places of exchanges, as opposed to locales of alternative models of education, such as Shantiniketan, of course, of living, such as the Golconda Ashram, or more provincial, or at least newer cities, such as Harbin. These are less associated with cosmopolitanism and at least a cosmopolitan imaginary. How important are these sites for you in generating new networks of anti-colonial struggle and nationalism?
Yes, well, I argued for the role of craft within, among other things, the Japanese nationalism, with that being inspired by, of course, the British arts and crafts movement. We see attention given to quite a well, the figure of the craftsman and his, unfortunately, mostly had, the colonies of craftspeople. So we can see the kind of rising popularity of visiting and certain maybe kind of tourism of these village of the kilns, and they becoming locations of modernity, such as Abiko, Mashiko, Seto, etc., places that were not on the map beforehand. Also, again, the Garakuta-shu, they created this very special locale, a very small hut in the Tokyo center, really in the fault of Tokyo modern. There was this very obscure small hut where things were happening. It became a transnational crossroad. And again, as Garakuta-shu was, because it was publicized in the places like Asahi Graph, very popular magazine, we have branches all over Japan, even in, for that matter, in Dalian, in Manchuria. And that these branches were replicating this hut. So we are getting this very strange locale for this kind of gathering and exchanges.
Thank you. Sanatana, would you like to add something quickly?
I don't know whether I'm going to answer this directly, but I think the regionalism and regionalism is part of the whole modernist project. It's also a kind of reinvented regions actually. So in that case, in Sri Lanka, Kandy become a kind of a very important center in that case. Like it's not polluted by the colonial rule. That's what they consider. So Kumarasamy organized a crafts guild in Kandy in 1903. Then also like some of these painters who participated in this 43 group, actually they went and lived in these areas. Like George Key decided to move back to Kandy and live there. And another painter called Dharanyagala actually moved to his village and started living there. So it's also kind of, so this is also kind of interesting dialogue happening in between this cosmopolitan or colonial city and the rural village life, or a village setting.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our three speakers. Thank you everyone in the audience for being with here this evening in Japan. We will have a short break of just under half an hour and resume at 11 o'clock in the UK, 8 in the evening in Japan. Thank you very much, and we look forward to having you for the rest of our symposium today and tomorrow.